The day my entire life shattered and rebuilt itself into something I never could have imagined started like any other Thursday morning at Rossi's Italian restaurant, with me covering bruises that had bloomed across my skin like poisonous flowers, and trying desperately to convince myself that this time would be different, that Marcus would change, that the man who'd wrapped his hands around my throat the night before while accusing me of infidelities I'd never even considered would somehow wake up and become the person I'd fallen in love with 2 years ago, when the world still seemed full of possibility instead of pain. I stood in the employee bathroom, my fingers trembling as I applied concealer to the yellowish-purple mark on my cheekbone where his knuckles had connected, layering foundation over the evidence of my shame, while my supervisor, Maria, knocked impatiently on the door and reminded me that the morning rush was about to begin, and that Mr. Moretti had just walked through the front entrance, which meant everyone needed to be perfect, because when Dante Moretti came to Rossi's, the entire restaurant transformed from a simple upscale Italian eatery into something that felt more like a stage where one wrong move could have consequences none of us wanted to imagine. I pulled my sleeves down carefully over my wrists, making sure the fabric covered the finger-shaped bruises that circled them like grotesque bracelets, souvenirs from when Marcus had grabbed me and slammed me against our apartment wall because I'd come home 20 minutes late from my shift, and he'd decided that meant I was cheating on him with someone from work, as if I had the energy or the desire to do anything except survive each day that stretched before me like an endless gray corridor with no exit in sight. The makeup looked good enough that most people wouldn't notice, and I'd become an expert over the past year at this particular performance, at smiling through the pain and pretending that everything was fine while my body told a different story in shades of purple and blue and sickening yellow. A story I was too ashamed and too terrified to share with anyone, because admitting what was happening would mean acknowledging that I'd become one of those women, the ones I used to see on television and wonder why they didn't just leave, as if leaving were ever that simple when you had nowhere to go and no money saved, and a boyfriend who'd promised more times than you could count that if you tried to walk away, he'd find you and make sure you regretted it for whatever remained of your miserable life. The restaurant was already buzzing with that particular energy that always accompanied Dante Moretti's visits, a tension that hummed through the air like electricity before a storm, making the waitstaff move faster and the kitchen staff work harder, and the owner himself, old Mr. Rossi, stand a little straighter, as if preparing for inspection by some higher authority who held the power of life and death in his perfectly manicured hands. I'd served Mr. Moretti maybe half a dozen times in the year I'd worked here, and each time I'd been struck by the contradiction he represented. A man who could order the most expensive wine on the menu with the refined palate of someone who'd been raised on nothing but the finest things, yet whose dark eyes held shadows that suggested he'd seen and done things that would make most people's nightmares seem like pleasant dreams, whose presence commanded respect not through loud demands, but through the quiet certainty that everyone in the room understood exactly who he was and what he was capable of if crossed. Maria grabbed my arm as I emerged from the bathroom, her grip unfortunately landing right on one of the newer bruises that made me wince despite my best efforts to hide it, and she assigned me to Mr. Moretti's table, with an expression that suggested she was doing me some kind of favor, even though we all knew that serving Chicago's most notorious Mafia boss was the kind of honor that came with risks I couldn't quite name, but could feel in the way my stomach twisted itself into knots. "Table 7, Elena, and for God's sake, don't mess this up. Mr. Moretti tips better than anyone when he's happy, and you know we need the money from tables like his to keep this place running. So smile and be professional, and remember that men like him appreciate good service and pretty girls who know how to keep their mouths shut about the conversations they overhear," she whispered urgently, before shoving me toward the dining room, where I could see him sitting in his usual corner booth, the one that gave him a clear view of both entrances, and kept his back to the wall in a way that spoke of a lifetime of watching for threats from every direction. He was with his second-in-command today, a man I'd heard other servers call Luca, who had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from granite, and an expression that suggested he'd forgotten how to smile sometime around the same time he'd learned how to kill efficiently. and they were deep in conversation about something that made Mr. Moretti's jaw tighten in that particular way that meant someone somewhere had made a mistake they'd probably regret. I approached their table with my professional smile firmly in place, the one I'd perfected after years of waitressing, the one that hid everything I was really feeling behind a mask of pleasant competence, and I pulled out my order pad while launching into my well-rehearsed greeting about the daily specials and whether they'd like to start with something to drink, all while trying desperately to ignore the way my ribs ached from where Marcus had kicked me when I'd curled up on the floor trying to protect myself from the worst of his rage. Mr. Moretti's eyes found mine immediately, and there was something in his gaze that made me feel simultaneously exposed and protected, as if he could see straight through all my carefully constructed defenses to the broken woman underneath, but wasn't judging me for it, wasn't finding me lacking the way Marcus always did when he listed all my failures and inadequacies in that voice that could cut deeper than any physical blow. "Espresso for me, Elena, and make sure it's the dark roast. Not that watered-down American nonsense that passes for coffee in most places," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive rasp that came from years of smoking expensive cigars and giving orders that men followed without question. And I nodded quickly while writing down his request and trying not to think about how he knew my name when I'd never formally introduced myself, which probably meant he knew everything about everyone who worked here because men in his position didn't leave their safety to chance. I turned to get Luca's order, and that's when it happened. The moment that would change absolutely everything about my life, though I didn't know it yet as I reached across the table for the sugar caddy, my sleeve riding up just enough to expose the vivid bruises that wrapped around my wrist like a death grip frozen in time. Purple and yellow and green all swirled together in a pattern that anyone with half a brain could recognize as handprints, as evidence of violence, as proof that someone had grabbed me hard enough and held on long enough to leave marks that would take weeks to fully fade. I saw Mr. Moretti's expression change in the span of a heartbeat, watched his dark eyes go from casually attentive to laser-focused on my wrist, watched something cold and deadly settle over his features in a way that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees, and before I could pull my arm back and hide the evidence of my shame, his hand shot out with surprising gentleness to catch my wrist, his touch so careful and controlled compared to Marcus's brutal grabs that I almost didn't recognize it as a man's hand on my skin. "Who did this to you?" The question came out quiet, controlled, but underneath his calm tone I could hear something that sounded like barely restrained fury, like a volcano about to erupt, like violence held in check by the thinnest thread of civilized behavior. And I felt my heart start to race in my chest because I knew with absolute certainty that how I answered this question would have consequences I couldn't begin to predict. His fingers stayed wrapped around my wrist, not gripping, not hurting, just holding my arm in place while he examined the bruises with the focused attention of someone conducting an investigation, his thumb tracing the edge of one particularly dark mark in a way that was almost tender, almost caring. And I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes because I couldn't remember the last time anyone had touched me with anything resembling gentleness, had looked at my injuries with anything other than indifference or satisfaction. I stammered something about being clumsy, about dropping things at home, about how I bruised easily, and it was really nothing to worry about. The lies tumbling from my lips, with practiced ease because I'd told them so many times before, to concerned coworkers and nosy neighbors, and the one friend I had left, who still bothered to call occasionally to check if I was still alive. But even as the words left my mouth, I could see in Mr. Moretti's eyes that he didn't believe a single syllable, could see that he recognized these bruises for exactly what they were, evidence of someone's hands on me, someone's anger translated into marks on my skin, someone's violence written across my body in a language that men like him could read as easily as others read books. "You're lying," he said simply, stating it as fact rather than accusation, and his thumb pressed slightly against my pulse point, where I was sure he could feel my heart hammering away, like a trapped bird throwing itself against the bars of a cage. And whoever put these marks on you made a grave mistake, because no one in my territory gets to hurt women without answering for it. I pulled my wrist free finally, clutching it to my chest as if I could somehow hide what he'd already seen, and I took a step back from the table while my mind raced through all the possible implications of this conversation, all the ways this could go wrong, all the dangers of involving a man like Dante Moretti in my personal disasters. "It's nothing, really, Mr. Moretti. I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine. Everything's fine. Please just let me get your espresso and we can pretend this conversation never happened," I said desperately. Knowing even as I spoke that there was no going back from this moment, that something had shifted irreversibly in the space between us, that he'd seen my bruises and made some kind of decision about them that I wasn't privy to but could feel hovering in the air like a promise or a threat, or possibly both at once. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving my face, and I watched him take in the concealer on my cheekbone that probably wasn't covering the bruise as well as I'd hoped. Watched him note the way I held myself carefully, as if my ribs hurt. Watched him catalog every visible sign of damage with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen violence in all its forms and knew exactly how to read its aftermath on a person's body and soul. "Go get my espresso, Elena," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of dismissal that somehow also sounded like a promise. "But understand that this conversation is far from over, and by the end of today, I'm going to know exactly who's been putting their hands on you, and that person is going to deeply regret every single moment they thought they could get away with hurting something that's under my protection now, whether you realize it yet or not." I fled to the kitchen on shaking legs, my mind reeling from the casual certainty in his voice when he said I was under his protection, as if he had the right to make that kind of declaration about my life, as if my safety was now his concern simply because he'd noticed my bruises and decided to care about them in a way that felt both terrifying and desperately, dangerously appealing. I made his espresso with trembling hands, trying to process what had just happened, while the rational part of my brain screamed that getting involved with Dante Moretti in any capacity was possibly the worst decision I could make, that men like him didn't help women out of the goodness of their hearts, that there would be a price for his protection that I probably couldn't afford to pay. And yet the irrational part of me, the part that was so tired of being afraid and hurt and alone, whispered that maybe, just maybe, having someone powerful notice my pain and decide to do something about it wasn't the worst thing that could happen. I returned to his table with the espresso, my sleeve now pulled down as far as it would go, and I found him watching me with an intensity that made me feel like I was the only person in the entire restaurant, possibly the only person in his entire world at that moment. And when I set his cup down, I noticed there was a business card lying next to a stack of $100 bills that represented more money than I made in 2 weeks of work. "My private number," he said quietly, tapping the card with one long finger. "And I want you to understand something very clearly, Elena. If you ever need help, if you ever find yourself in danger, if that person who left those bruises on you ever touches you again, you call that number immediately, day or night, and I will handle it. Because I meant what I said about you being under my protection now, and I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." The rest of my shift passed in a blur of confusion and fear and something I was afraid to name that felt suspiciously like hope. And when I finally clocked out at 10 that evening, exhausted and aching, and dreading going home to face Marcus's inevitable questions about why I was late and what I'd been doing and who I'd been talking to, I found myself standing in the dark parking lot behind the restaurant with my phone ringing in my hand, Marcus's name flashing on the screen with increasing urgency, while I stared at the business card I'd tucked into my apron pocket, despite every logical reason I should have thrown it away. My finger hovered over the answer button because I knew that not answering would only make things worse when I got home, would only fuel his paranoia and his rage and his need to punish me for imagined transgressions. But before I could bring myself to accept the call, a dark SUV with tinted windows pulled into the parking lot and came to a stop directly beside me, the passenger window rolling down to reveal Dante Moretti sitting in the back seat, his expression unreadable in the dim light, but his eyes finding mine with unerring accuracy. "Get in, Elena," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, carrying the same tone he probably used when giving orders to his soldiers that they followed without question. "I'm taking you home, and we're going to have a conversation about what happens next, because I've spent the last 12 hours learning everything there is to know about Marcus Reynolds, your boyfriend of 2 years, who has a history of bar fights and drunk and disorderly charges, and a reputation among his neighbors for being the kind of man who likes to yell at his girlfriend loud enough that the whole building can hear it. And I've decided that after tonight, you're not going to have to worry about him anymore." I stood frozen in place, my phone still ringing insistently in my hand, torn between the devil I knew and the one I didn't. Between the familiar hell of my apartment, where at least I understood the rules of survival, and the unknown territory of accepting help from a man whose very name made hardened criminals nervous. And in that moment of hesitation, Dante Moretti did something that shattered all my carefully constructed defenses. He looked at me with an expression that was equal parts fury at whoever had hurt me and determination to make sure it never happened again. And he said in a voice that was somehow both gentle and absolutely terrifying in its conviction, "I know you're afraid, Piccola. I know you don't trust easily anymore, and you have no reason to trust me. But I'm asking you to take a leap of faith tonight. To get in this car and let me protect you the way you should have been protected all along. Because I swear on everything I hold sacred that I will never, ever let anyone hurt you again, the way that man has been hurting you." And God help me, despite every warning bell going off in my head, despite knowing that accepting his help would change my life in ways I couldn't begin to imagine, despite the absolute insanity of trusting Chicago's most dangerous mafia boss with my safety, I found myself opening the car door and sliding into the seat beside him, while my phone continued to ring with Marcus's increasingly angry calls. And as the SUV pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward my apartment, I realized that I had just made a choice that would either save my life or end it, and I wouldn't know which until it was far too late to turn back. The drive through Chicago's dark streets felt surreal and dreamlike as I sat beside Dante Moretti in the back of his SUV, the leather seats soft beneath me while my phone continued its insistent buzzing in my purse with Marcus's calls that I couldn't bring myself to answer, because I knew that whatever words came out of his mouth would be laced with accusations and threats that would make my stomach twist with that familiar mixture of fear and resignation that had become my constant companion over the past year. Dante hadn't spoken since I'd gotten into the car, but his presence beside me was overwhelming in its intensity, radiating a kind of controlled power that made the air feel charged and heavy, and I could feel his eyes on me periodically, assessing, calculating, probably wondering what he'd gotten himself into by deciding to insert himself into the messy disaster of my life, as if I were some damsel in distress worth saving, when the truth was that I'd made every choice that led me to this moment, had chosen Marcus, had stayed with Marcus, had convinced myself over and over that the violence was somehow my fault because I wasn't good enough, or smart enough, or careful enough to avoid triggering his rage. "You don't have to go back there tonight," Dante said finally, his voice cutting through the silence that had settled between us like a blade through silk, smooth and sharp and impossible to ignore. "I have properties all over the city where you could stay, places where Marcus would never find you, places with security that would make sure you're safe while I handle the situation in a way that ensures he never lays another finger on you for the rest of his miserable life." The casual way he spoke about handling Marcus, as if my boyfriend were nothing more than a minor inconvenience to be dealt with and dismissed, should have terrified me, but instead I felt something that might have been relief flooding through my chest, washing away some of the constant tension I'd been carrying for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to exist without that weight pressing down on every breath I took and every decision I made. But even as part of me wanted desperately to accept his offer, to let this dangerous man sweep into my life and fix everything I'd been too weak and too scared to fix myself, the rational part of my brain that had kept me alive this long whispered warnings about debts and obligations, and the fact that men like Dante Moretti didn't do favors without expecting something in return. didn't rescue random waitresses out of the goodness of their hearts, didn't involve themselves in domestic situations unless there was something in it for them that I couldn't yet see but would undoubtedly reveal itself when it was too late to back out. "I can't just disappear," I heard myself saying, my voice sounding weak and uncertain even to my own ears. "Marcus will lose his mind if I don't come home. He'll call my work. He'll call the police. He'll make it into this whole thing where I'm the crazy one who ran away for no reason, and besides, all my things are there, my clothes and my documents, and the little bit of money I've managed to hide away from him, and I can't just leave everything behind like my life doesn't matter." Dante turned to face me fully then, and in the dim light filtering through the tinted windows from the street lamps we passed, I could see something in his expression that looked almost like understanding, mixed with a frustration that seemed directed not at me, but at the situation itself, at a world where women felt trapped by circumstances, and abusive men, and the accumulated weight of possessions that somehow became more important than safety, because we'd been conditioned to believe that leaving meant losing everything we'd worked for. "Your life is the only thing that matters, Elena. Not your clothes or your documents or whatever money you've managed to squirrel away while living with a man who probably monitors every penny you spend and demands to know where you've been every moment you're not under his direct supervision," he said, with a certainty that made me wonder how much he'd learned about my relationship during his 12 hours of investigation. How many of my private shames and secret fears he'd uncovered through whatever means men like him used to gather information about people they'd decided to concern themselves with. Before I could formulate a response that didn't make me sound completely pathetic and broken beyond repair, the SUV pulled up in front of my apartment building. That depressing 5-story structure with peeling paint and broken security cameras that the landlord had never bothered to fix, because most of the tenants were too poor or too desperate to complain about anything as long as they had a roof over their heads. My stomach clenched with dread as I stared up at the 4th-floor window, where I could see lights on in the apartment I shared with Marcus, which meant he was home and awake and undoubtedly working himself into a rage over my failure to answer his calls, probably drinking himself into that particular state of intoxication where his inhibitions disappeared completely and his fists became the primary method of communication he employed to express his displeasure with my existence. "I need to go up alone," I said quickly, already reaching for the door handle because I knew from painful experience that Marcus's anger only escalated when he felt embarrassed or challenged in front of others, and having Dante Moretti escort me to my door would result in a confrontation that could only end badly for everyone involved. Or at least, that's what I told myself, even though deep down, I knew I was just trying to protect Marcus from consequences he'd more than earned through his repeated violations of my body and spirit. But Dante's hand closed gently around my wrist. Not the injured one, but the other. His grip firm enough to stop me from bolting, but careful enough that it didn't hurt. And when I looked back at him, I saw something in his eyes that I couldn't quite name. Something that looked like concern mixed with determination, and underlaid with a darkness that reminded me exactly who I was dealing with and what he was capable of when someone crossed lines he'd drawn in his own moral code. "You have my number in your phone now, correct?" he asked, and I nodded even though I wasn't entirely sure when he'd managed to get my number, or how he'd programmed his contact information into my device without me noticing, though I supposed men with his resources could accomplish such things without breaking a sweat. "If anything happens, if he touches you, if you need help, you text me immediately and I'll be there before you can count to 10. And Elena, I need you to understand that I'm not offering this lightly or as some kind of empty gesture. When I say I'll protect you, I mean it with every fiber of my being, and there is nothing that man can do to you that will be worse than what I'll do to him if he gives me a reason." I pulled my wrist free and climbed out of the SUV on legs that felt unsteady beneath me, my heart hammering against my ribs as I walked toward the entrance of my building, while trying to formulate some kind of plan for how I was going to handle Marcus's inevitable explosion when I walked through the door 30 minutes later than my shift had ended. The heavy door of the building closed behind me with a finality that felt ominous, and I climbed the stairs slowly, each step taking me closer to whatever waited for me in apartment 4B, where I could already hear raised voices from down the hall that suggested Marcus wasn't the only person in the building having a terrible night. though I suspected mine was about to get considerably worse than anyone else's in this godforsaken place. I stood outside my own door for a long moment, keys in hand, trying to gather whatever courage I could find in the depleted reserves of my spirit. And I briefly considered turning around and running back down those stairs to where Dante's SUV was probably still idling at the curb. But pride and stubbornness, and that terrible voice in my head that sounded disturbingly like Marcus telling me I was worthless and stupid and lucky anyone would put up with me at all, made me turn the key in the lock and push open the door to face whatever music was waiting to be played. The apartment was dark, except for the flickering light of the television in the living room, and I could see Marcus's silhouette on the couch, could see the bottle of whiskey on the coffee table that was already half empty, could feel the dangerous energy radiating from him, even from across the room, as he turned his head to look at me with eyes that held nothing but contempt and barely restrained violence. "Where the hell have you been?" His voice was slurred but sharp, each word a little missile aimed at my composure, and I felt my shoulders hunch automatically into that defensive posture I'd adopted over months of similar confrontations, trying to make myself smaller and less threatening, and less likely to provoke the rage I could see building behind his bloodshot eyes. "Your shift ended at 10, and it's now 10:45, which means you've been somewhere doing something you shouldn't have been doing, probably spreading your legs for whatever cook or busboy or customer caught your attention today, because that's what sluts like you do when given half a chance." The familiar litany of accusations washed over me like toxic rain, each insult designed to erode whatever self-worth I still possessed, and I opened my mouth to offer the explanations and apologies he expected, to grovel and beg for forgiveness for crimes I hadn't committed. But before I could speak, he was on his feet and moving toward me with that particular gait that signaled danger, that unsteady but purposeful stride of a drunk man who decided violence was the only appropriate response to whatever perceived slight he'd convinced himself had occurred. I backed toward the kitchen automatically, my body operating on instinct and experience, knowing that at least in there I had the kitchen island to put between us, and potentially utensils I could grab if things got really bad, though I'd never actually had the courage to defend myself with anything more substantial than my arms raised to protect my face, and my body curled into the smallest possible target. Marcus followed me with the inexorable certainty of a predator tracking wounded prey, and when he cornered me against the counter, his hand shot out to grab my hair, yanking my head back with enough force to make tears spring to my eyes, while his face came close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the rage distorting his features into something barely recognizable as the man I'd once thought I loved. "You think I don't know what you're up to?" he hissed, his free hand grabbing the front of my shirt and twisting the fabric until it pulled tight across my throat, restricting my breathing in a way that sent panic flooding through my system, because this was new. This was escalating beyond the usual slaps and shoves into territory that felt genuinely life-threatening. "You think I don't see the way you dress for work, the way you do your makeup, the way you smile at customers like you're advertising yourself as available for whatever they want to pay for?" I tried to speak, tried to deny his accusations and calm him down the way I'd learned to do through painful trial and error. But his grip on my shirt was cutting off my air, and all that came out was a strangled wheeze that seemed to enrage him further, seemed to flip some switch in his alcohol-soaked brain that transformed him from merely angry to genuinely dangerous in the space between one heartbeat and the next. His hands moved to my throat then, fingers wrapping around my windpipe with increasing pressure, and I clawed at his wrists desperately while my lungs began to burn and black spots danced at the edges of my vision. And somewhere in the part of my mind that wasn't consumed with the immediate terror of suffocation, I realized with crystal clarity that this was it. This was the moment I'd always known was coming. This was how my story ended in a shitty apartment with a man who'd promised to love me but had instead decided to kill me over imagined infidelities and perceived disrespect. But just as consciousness started to slip away and my struggling began to weaken, Marcus's phone rang from somewhere in the living room, that distinctive ringtone he used for work calls that he never ignored no matter what else was happening. And the interruption was enough to break through his rage-induced focus, so that his grip loosened just slightly. just enough for me to draw a gasping breath and wrench myself free, stumbling backward into the kitchen table and nearly falling over a chair in my desperation to put distance between us. He stood there for a moment, chest heaving and eyes wild, looking at his hands as if surprised to find them empty. And then he turned and stalked toward the living room to answer his phone, leaving me collapsed against the kitchen table, with my throat on fire and my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst straight through my chest wall. And I knew with absolute certainty that next time, because there would definitely be a next time, he wouldn't stop, wouldn't be interrupted, would follow through on the violence that had been building in him for months, until the only thing left of me would be a cautionary tale and a police report, and maybe a brief mention in the local news about domestic violence gone wrong. My phone was still in my purse where I'd dropped it by the door when I came in, and I moved toward it with the slow, careful steps of someone trying not to attract a predator's attention. My entire body shaking with adrenaline and shock, and the aftermath of oxygen deprivation that made my thoughts feel fuzzy and disconnected from reality. I could hear Marcus in the living room talking to whoever had called, his voice taking on that false professional tone he used with people he wanted to impress. And I knew I had maybe 5 minutes before he hung up and remembered he'd been in the middle of trying to strangle me. 5 minutes to make a decision that would determine whether I survived this night or became another statistic in a system that failed women like me over and over again. My fingers found my phone and pulled up Dante's contact information, and I stared at his number for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, warring with myself about whether accepting help from a mafia boss was somehow worse than dying at the hands of my boyfriend, whether owing Dante Moretti a debt was more dangerous than staying in this apartment where Marcus was probably already planning how to finish what he'd started, whether I had any right to drag someone else into the disaster zone my life had become just because he'd noticed my bruises and made promises I had no reason to believe he'd keep. But then I heard Marcus hang up the phone, heard his footsteps heading back toward the kitchen, heard him muttering under his breath about finishing what we'd started, and teaching me a lesson I'd never forget. And in that moment, all my philosophical debates and moral qualms evaporated like morning mist under harsh sunlight, because survival wasn't a luxury I could afford to complicate with ethical considerations. My thumbs flew over the screen, typing out a message that felt simultaneously like a prayer and a surrender, and possibly the last autonomous decision I'd make before my life spiraled into something I couldn't control or predict. 3 words that would change everything. Help. 2247 Ashland Ave, Apt 4B. And I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then shoved my phone into my pocket just as Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that promised violence and pain and possibly the end of everything I'd ever been or hoped to become. "Where were we?" he asked, with false pleasantness that was somehow more terrifying than his rage had been, taking a step toward me while I backed away until I hit the counter and had nowhere else to go, nowhere to run, nothing to do but close my eyes and pray that Dante had meant what he said about being there in seconds, about protecting me, about making sure Marcus never hurt me again, though I had no idea how he could possibly arrive in time to prevent what was about to happen, or what price I'd pay for his intervention when this night was finally over. Marcus's hands reached for me again, and I felt his fingers brush against my arm, just as the apartment door literally exploded inward with a crash that sounded like thunder, the wood splintering around the lock as if it were made of paper instead of solid oak. And suddenly, Dante Moretti was standing in my destroyed doorway, like some avenging angel from a very dark heaven, his expensive suit somehow making him look even more dangerous, his eyes finding me immediately before tracking to Marcus with an expression that promised death, and worse than death for what he'd interrupted. "You made a mistake touching what's mine," Dante said in a voice that was terrifyingly calm and controlled, each word precisely enunciated as he stepped into the apartment and let the ruined door swing shut behind him as much as it could, given that the frame was now completely destroyed. And I saw Marcus's face go pale as he realized exactly who had just broken into our home and exactly how much trouble he was in. Saw him try to stammer out some explanation or justification or plea for mercy that died unspoken when Dante took another step forward with the casual confidence of a man who'd walked into dangerous situations 1,000 times before and emerged victorious from every single one. "Your girlfriend? She's my girlfriend, you can't just—" Marcus started to say, his voice cracking with fear and probably belated recognition that he'd crossed some line he didn't even know existed. But Dante cut him off with a gesture that somehow conveyed more menace than any words could have. And I watched from my position against the counter as these two men faced off in my tiny kitchen, with my future hanging in the balance between them. One representing everything I'd endured and survived for the past year. The other representing something I couldn't name but felt inexorably drawn toward despite every warning bell, screaming in my head that I was jumping from one dangerous situation into something potentially even more perilous. "She stopped being yours the moment you raised your hand to her," Dante said quietly, and then he moved with a speed that seemed impossible for someone his size, crossed the distance between them, and had Marcus pinned against the refrigerator, before my boyfriend could even think about defending himself. And I watched with a mixture of horror and shameful satisfaction as Dante's fist connected with Marcus's face once, twice, 3 times in quick succession, each impact accompanied by sounds that made my stomach turn, but that also triggered something that felt disturbingly like relief, because someone was finally making Marcus feel even a fraction of the pain he'd inflicted on me over months of escalating violence. But then Dante's phone rang, and he answered it without releasing his grip on Marcus's throat. And I heard him give terse instructions to someone named Luca about cleanup and disposal, and making sure the message was sent loud and clear that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated in his territory. And that's when the full reality of what I'd done finally crashed over me like a tidal wave, because I'd just invited the Mafia into my life, had just given Dante Moretti permission to handle my problems in ways that probably involved the kind of violence that couldn't be undone or explained away, or smoothed over with apologies and promises of better behavior. Marcus had gone limp in Dante's grip. Whether unconscious or just too terrified to move, I couldn't tell from where I stood, and when Dante finally released him and let his body slide down the refrigerator to crumple on the floor in a heap of damaged flesh and broken pride, I felt my knees start to give out beneath me from the shock and the adrenaline crash, and the overwhelming realization that my life as I'd known it had just ended forever, that there was no going back from this moment, that I'd made a choice that would reverberate through every day I had left on this earth. Dante turned to me then, and the concern in his eyes as he crossed the kitchen to where I was barely holding myself upright seemed genuine and deep and completely at odds with the violence he'd just casually dispensed. And when his hands touched my shoulders gently, carefully, as if I were something precious that might break under rough handling, I felt tears start to stream down my face because I couldn't remember the last time anyone had touched me like that. Like I mattered. Like I was worth protecting instead of destroying. "Come on, Piccola," he said softly, wrapping an arm around my waist to support my weight when my legs finally gave out completely. "Let's get you out of here before my men arrive to handle the cleanup, and I promise you that you're safe now, that no one will ever hurt you like this again, that I'll make sure Marcus understands that he's going to disappear from Chicago tonight, and if he ever even thinks about coming near you again, he won't just disappear. He'll suffer in ways that will make what just happened to him seem like a pleasant massage in comparison." He guided me toward the door, stepping carefully over debris from the destroyed frame, and I let him lead me because I didn't have the strength or the will to resist. Didn't have anywhere else to go or anyone else to turn to. And as we emerged into the hallway where neighbors were starting to peek out of their apartments to see what all the noise had been about, I caught sight of my reflection in a mirror hanging on the wall, and barely recognized the woman staring back at me with her bruised throat and tear-stained face, and eyes that held a mixture of terror and hope and resignation to whatever fate awaited her in the arms of Chicago's most dangerous man, who'd somehow decided she was worth saving from the smaller monster she'd been living with. I woke to sunlight streaming through windows that stretched from floor to ceiling in a room so beautiful it seemed like something out of a magazine spread about how the obscenely wealthy lived. All cream-colored silk curtains and furniture that looked like it cost more than I'd earned in my entire life. And for a disorienting moment I thought I was dreaming, or dead, or somehow transported into an alternate reality, where girls like me got to sleep in beds with sheets that felt like clouds against skin that ached and throbbed with reminders of the previous night's violence. My body protested when I tried to sit up, ribs screaming with pain that suggested they were cracked, if not broken outright, throat raw and bruised from Marcus's hands in a way that made swallowing feel like dragging razor blades down my esophagus. And as consciousness fully returned, I remembered everything. The attack, the text message, Dante exploding through my door like some dark avenging force, the drive through Chicago's pre-dawn streets to this estate that looked more like a palace than a home, the way he'd carried me up a sweeping staircase when my legs wouldn't support me anymore and deposited me in this bedroom with instructions to rest while he handled the details of making Marcus permanently disappear from my life. The clothes I'd been wearing last night were gone, replaced with pajamas made of fabric so soft and expensive, I was almost afraid to move in them, for fear of somehow damaging them. And on the nightstand beside the bed, I found a glass of water, several bottles of prescription pain medication with my name already on the labels even though I had no memory of seeing a doctor, and a handwritten note in masculine scrawl that read, "You're safe now. Rest. When you wake, press the button beside the bed and Rosa will bring you breakfast. D." I stared at that note for a long time, trying to process the surreal reality of my situation, trying to understand how in the span of less than 12 hours, I'd gone from a woman trapped in an abusive relationship and living in a rundown apartment to someone sleeping in luxury and receiving personal notes from a man whose very name made hardened criminals nervous. And I couldn't decide if I should feel grateful or terrified, or some complicated mixture of both that left me emotionally paralyzed and unable to determine whether I'd been rescued or merely transferred from one form of captivity to another that came with better amenities. The pain in my ribs finally motivated me to reach for the medication bottles, and I discovered that someone had indeed examined me while I was unconscious, or too out of it to remember. Because the dosage instructions were specific and detailed, and mentioned treatment for 3 cracked ribs, severe contusions, and signs of strangulation that required monitoring for potential complications. The thought of being examined while unconscious should have bothered me more than it did. But honestly, after everything I'd been through, the violation of having a doctor check my injuries seemed minor compared to the violations Marcus had subjected me to regularly. And at least this examination had been conducted with the goal of healing rather than causing additional harm, had been done by someone working under Dante's orders to make sure I received proper care, rather than someone using my body as a canvas for their rage and insecurity. I took the pills and pressed the button Dante had mentioned in his note, not because I was particularly hungry, but because I needed to see another human being. Needed to confirm that this was real, and not some elaborate fantasy my oxygen-deprived brain had constructed while Marcus was strangling me to death in our kitchen. Within moments, there was a gentle knock on the door, and a woman who appeared to be in her late 50s entered carrying a tray that smelled like heaven, all warm bread and coffee and eggs prepared in ways that made my stomach suddenly remember it had been nearly 24 hours since I'd eaten anything substantial. She had kind eyes and the sort of maternal presence that made me want to cry just from the gentle way she looked at me, as if I were something precious and fragile that needed careful handling, rather than something broken and worthless that deserved whatever violence came my way. "Good morning, dear. My name is Rosa, and I manage Mr. Moretti's household staff, and I've been instructed to make sure you have everything you need while you're recovering from your ordeal," she said, in accented English that suggested Italian was her first language, setting the tray across my lap with practiced efficiency before stepping back to assess me with the critical eye of someone who'd probably seen her share of battered women pass through these doors. "Mr. Moretti asked me to tell you that you're welcome to stay as long as you need, that all your belongings from your apartment have been collected and cleaned and are waiting in the closet if you want them, though he's also taken the liberty of having some new clothes purchased in your size if you prefer to start fresh, without reminders of your previous living situation." The casual way she mentioned my belongings being collected, as if Dante had every right to enter my apartment and remove my possessions without explicit permission, should have raised more red flags than it did. But I was discovering that my capacity for outrage and boundary setting had been so thoroughly eroded by Marcus's constant violations that having someone make decisions on my behalf felt almost comforting rather than controlling, especially when those decisions seemed aimed at improving my circumstances rather than limiting my autonomy. I ate the breakfast Rosa had brought while she bustled around the room, opening curtains and straightening things that didn't need straightening, and I got the distinct impression she was staying to keep me company, rather than because there was actual work to be done, probably under instructions from Dante to make sure I didn't wake up alone and disoriented and potentially decide to flee before he had a chance to explain whatever plans he'd made for my immediate future. "How long have I been asleep?" I asked between bites of the most delicious eggs I'd ever tasted, my voice coming out hoarse and damaged in a way that made Rosa's expression tighten with sympathy and something that looked like barely suppressed anger at whoever had done this to me. And she informed me that I'd been unconscious for almost 14 hours, that Dante's private doctor had sedated me after examining my injuries because he'd felt I needed uninterrupted rest more than anything else, that it was now almost noon on Friday, which meant I'd essentially lost an entire day to drugged sleep while the world continued spinning without my participation. The thought of Marcus crossed my mind suddenly and violently, and I found myself asking Rosa if she knew what had happened to him, if he was okay, if he was alive. Questions that I immediately regretted because they revealed how thoroughly he'd conditioned me to worry about his well-being even after he'd tried to kill me, to prioritize his safety over my own, to feel somehow responsible for whatever consequences his actions brought down on his own head. Rosa's expression hardened in a way that transformed her kind face into something almost frightening, and she told me in a voice that carried absolute certainty that I should stop wasting emotional energy on a man who'd never deserved even a moment of my consideration, that Mr. Moretti had handled the situation in a way that ensured Marcus would never bother me again, and that I should focus on healing and deciding what I wanted my future to look like now that I was free from the prison I'd been living in for far too long. After Rosa left with promises to return later with lunch, I forced myself out of bed, despite my body's protests, and made my way to the bathroom that adjoined this palatial bedroom, a.e., space approximately the size of my entire former living room, with a soaking tub that could fit 3 people, and a shower with so many jets and settings I couldn't begin to figure out how to operate it properly. I caught sight of myself in the mirror, that covered most of one wall, and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Her throat painted in shades of purple and black that clearly showed the outline of fingers. Her face pale and haunted. Her eyes holding a mixture of relief and guilt and fear that seemed to war with each other for dominance in her expression. I looked like a victim, which I supposed was accurate enough, but I also looked like someone who'd survived, someone who'd made the choice to reach out for help, instead of accepting death as the inevitable conclusion to a relationship that had been killing me slowly for months, before Marcus finally decided to speed up the process with his hands around my throat. The rest of that first day passed in a haze of medication and sleep, and brief moments of wakefulness where Rosa or other staff members, whose names I couldn't keep track of, brought me food and drinks, and gentle conversation that never pushed for details about what I'd been through, or judgments about the choices I'd made. Dante himself didn't appear, which surprised me given how invested he'd seemed in my well-being the previous night. But Rosa explained when I asked that he was handling business matters related to my situation, making sure that certain loose ends were tied up, and certain messages were sent to anyone who might think they could take advantage of my vulnerable position now that I was under his protection. The way she said his protection made it sound like both a blessing and a claim of ownership, and I found myself wondering for the 1,000th time what exactly I'd agreed to by accepting Dante's help, what obligations I'd incurred by sending that desperate text message, what prices I'd eventually be expected to pay for the sanctuary I was currently enjoying. It was almost midnight when I woke from another medication-induced nap to find Dante sitting in a chair beside my bed, his presence startling me badly enough that I gasped, and immediately regretted it when the movement sent pain shooting through my damaged ribs. He looked exhausted in a way I'd never seen before, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept since the previous night. His usually immaculate suit rumpled and his tie loosened as if he'd been pulling at it in frustration or stress. And when our eyes met across the dim room, I saw something in his expression that looked almost vulnerable, almost uncertain, as if he wasn't quite sure what to do with the broken woman he'd collected from a shabby apartment and installed in his home like some sort of rescue project he hadn't fully thought through. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said quietly, his voice rough with fatigue. "But I wanted to check on you myself before I went to sleep, wanted to make sure you were comfortable and had everything you needed. Wanted to give you the opportunity to ask me questions about what happens next because I imagine you have quite a few, and you deserve answers even if some of those answers might be difficult to hear." I struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain the movement caused, and he was on his feet immediately with his hands hovering near me as if he wanted to help, but wasn't sure if his touch would be welcome. Wasn't sure if I'd flinch away from him the way I'd learned to flinch away from Marcus's hands that only ever brought pain and never comfort, and I found myself reaching for him deliberately, placing my hand on his arm in a gesture meant to communicate that I understood the difference between violence and protection, between hands that destroyed and hands that saved. We talked for hours that night, Dante pulling his chair closer to the bed so I didn't have to strain to hear his quiet voice in the darkness, broken only by moonlight streaming through those enormous windows. And he told me things I suspected he didn't share with many people. About his mother, who died at his father's hands when Dante was 15. About how he'd killed his father in revenge, and never regretted it for a single moment. About how he'd built his empire on the principle that women and children were sacred and untouchable, and that any man under his authority who violated that principle would face consequences that made death seem merciful in comparison. He explained that Marcus was alive but barely, recovering in a hospital 2 states away, under a false name with injuries that would take months to heal, and that when he was sufficiently recovered, he'd be given a new identity and a one-way ticket to South America, with explicit instructions that returning to Chicago or attempting any contact with me would result in a slow and painful death that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might think about ignoring Dante's commands. "You didn't have to do all that for me," I whispered when he finished explaining the elaborate arrangements he'd made to ensure my safety. "I'm nobody special, just a waitress who served you coffee a few times, just another woman who made bad choices and ended up with a man who hurt her. Just someone who should have been strong enough to leave on her own instead of needing you to rescue me like some damsel in distress from a fairy tale where the monster turns out to be the hero." But Dante reached out and took my hand in his grip gentle and warm, and completely devoid of the possessive, crushing force that Marcus had always employed when touching me. And he told me in a voice that carried absolute conviction that I was wrong about being nobody special, that from the moment he'd seen those bruises on my wrist, something had shifted in his chest, that he'd recognized something in my eyes that called to whatever broken parts of himself he usually kept locked away behind walls of violence and power and carefully maintained control. "As for what you owe me," he continued, anticipating the question I'd been afraid to ask, the concern that had been gnawing at me since I woke up in this beautiful room. "The answer is nothing, Elena. You owe me absolutely nothing except maybe allowing me the privilege of making sure you're safe and cared for while you heal, and figure out what you want to do with your life now that you're free from the man who was slowly destroying you." I wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that his motivations were pure, and his assistance came without strings attached. But I'd learned through painful experience that men didn't do things without expecting something in return, didn't invest time and resources and effort into women unless there was a payoff they were anticipating. And I couldn't quite make myself trust that Dante Moretti, Chicago's most feared mafia boss, was the exception to that rule simply because he claimed to have a soft spot for abused women that stemmed from his own traumatic childhood. The days that followed established a routine that felt surreal in its domesticity and luxury, with Rosa bringing me meals that were works of culinary art, and Dante visiting every evening to sit beside my bed and talk about everything from books to music, to his complicated feelings about the empire he'd built on violence and fear, and the absolute loyalty of men who would kill at his command without questioning his orders. I learned that he owned legitimate businesses alongside his illegal operations, that he employed hundreds of people who depended on him for their livelihoods, that he donated anonymously to women's shelters and organizations that helped victims of domestic violence escape their abusers, though he made me promise never to mention those donations because maintaining his reputation as a heartless criminal was essential to the power structure that kept him alive and in control of his territory. We talked about my dreams and aspirations, the teaching career I'd abandoned when Marcus convinced me I wasn't smart enough for college, the art classes I'd loved in high school before my mother died and left me alone in a world that felt too big and too dangerous to navigate without someone telling me what to do and who to be. And Dante listened with an attention and genuine interest that made me feel seen and valued in ways I'd forgotten were possible. By the end of my second week in his home, I was moving around more easily, the pain in my ribs fading to a dull ache that only flared when I moved wrong or breathed too deeply. The bruises on my throat transitioning through that sickly yellow-green stage that signaled healing, even as they remained visible enough to remind me every time I looked in a mirror of how close I'd come to dying in that apartment. Dante had been careful to maintain physical distance between us, despite the emotional intimacy of our late-night conversations, never touching me, beyond occasional gentle contact when helping me stand or steadying me when I wobbled on still weak legs. And I found myself simultaneously grateful for his restraint and confused by my growing desire to close that distance, to explore whether the electric tension I felt building between us was real, or just my damaged psyche latching onto my rescuer in some textbook case of trauma bonding and misplaced gratitude. It was during the third week of my stay, when I'd finally felt strong enough to venture beyond my bedroom and explore the sprawling estate that Dante called home, that everything shifted in ways I couldn't have predicted and didn't know how to process even as they were happening. I'd made my way downstairs to the library Rosa had mentioned, a room that held thousands of books on shelves that stretched to ceilings so high they required rolling ladders to access the upper sections, and I was lost in examining titles when I heard raised voices coming from somewhere nearby. The sound of Dante arguing with someone in Italian, so rapid and furious I couldn't follow the words, but could absolutely understand the anger behind them. Curiosity and concern drew me toward the noise, and I found myself standing in the doorway of what appeared to be Dante's office, watching him pace back and forth while shouting into his phone at someone who'd apparently made a serious error in judgment regarding business matters I couldn't begin to understand. And the man I saw in that moment was not the gentle caretaker who'd been visiting my bedside every evening, but rather the feared Mafia boss who'd built an empire on violence and intimidation and the absolute certainty that his word was law. He looked up and saw me standing there, his expression transforming instantly from rage to concern as he abruptly ended his call and crossed the room toward me with hands outstretched, as if afraid I'd witnessed something that would frighten me away. And maybe a few weeks ago it would have. Maybe the old Elena who'd been so thoroughly broken by Marcus would have seen Dante's capacity for violence and run in the opposite direction. But the woman I was becoming understood that there was a vast difference between violence employed to protect and violence employed to control, between a man who killed to defend what he considered his and a man who hurt others simply because he could. "I'm sorry you had to see that side of me," he said, when he reached where I stood frozen in the doorway. "I try to keep the uglier aspects of my business away from you. Try to maintain some separation between the man who sits beside your bed and talks about poetry and the man who runs an organization built on fear and bloodshed. But I suppose it was inevitable that you'd eventually witness the reality of who I am and what I do." But instead of backing away like he clearly expected, I found myself stepping forward into the room, closing the distance between us in a way that felt both terrifying and necessary. And I told him something I'd only recently come to understand about myself and my situation, that I wasn't afraid of his violence because I'd finally learned to distinguish between dangerous men who hurt the vulnerable and dangerous men who protected them, that I understood he was capable of terrible things, but that those terrible things were directed at people who deserved them, rather than at innocent women who'd done nothing wrong except trust the wrong person. "I'm not afraid of you, Dante," I said, my voice still carrying that hoarse quality from the damage to my throat, but stronger now than it had been in weeks. "I should be. I know I should be. But I'm not. And I'm starting to think that maybe what I'm actually feeling is something else entirely, something I don't have a name for yet. But that feels like the opposite of fear. Like safety mixed with attraction, mixed with gratitude, mixed with something that might be the beginning of trust, even though I don't trust easily anymore, and probably won't ever trust the way normal people do after everything Marcus did to destroy that capacity in me." The look on Dante's face when I finished that rambling confession was something I'd never seen before. A mixture of desire and restraint, and wonder and fear that made him seem almost human, rather than the untouchable crime lord who commanded armies of loyal soldiers. And when he reached up to cup my face in his hands with a gentleness that made my heart stutter in my chest, I knew we were crossing some invisible line that we couldn't uncross, moving from rescuer and victim into territory that was complicated and potentially dangerous, but also felt more real and more right than anything I'd experienced in years of slowly dying in Marcus's orbit. "You should be afraid of me, Piccola," he whispered, his thumb tracing the fading bruises on my jaw, with a touch so light it barely registered. "Because I'm starting to want things I have no right to want, starting to think about you in ways that go far beyond simple protection, starting to imagine a future where you're not just a woman I saved, but something more, something precious, something mine in ways that have nothing to do with obligation, and everything to do with desire and possession and feelings I swore I'd never allow myself to develop for anyone, because caring about someone makes you vulnerable, and vulnerability is death in my world." Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't sound completely insane, given that I'd only known this man for 3 weeks, and had spent most of that time recovering from injuries inflicted by my last relationship, before I could talk myself out of what I was feeling, by reminding myself of all the very good reasons why getting involved with a mafia boss was potentially the worst decision I could make. His phone rang again, with a tone that apparently signaled an emergency he couldn't ignore, and he stepped back from me with visible reluctance while answering the call, and immediately switching into the cold, authoritative voice of someone giving orders that would be followed without question. I listened as he instructed someone named Luca to handle a situation involving a rival family that had apparently decided to test his control over territory by attacking one of his businesses. And when he hung up and turned back to me, I could see the war happening behind his eyes between the man who wanted to stay and continue our conversation and the leader who had responsibilities he couldn't shirk, no matter how much he might want to remain in this room with me. "I have to go handle this situation before it escalates into something that requires a level of violence I'd prefer to avoid," he told me, already moving toward the door while simultaneously issuing instructions via text message to multiple people whose names I didn't recognize. "But when I get back, whenever that might be, we're going to finish this conversation and figure out what the hell is happening between us, and whether it's real or just some complicated trauma response that will fade once you're fully recovered and ready to return to your own life, whatever that ends up looking like." He paused in the doorway and turned back to look at me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. And then he said something that felt like both a promise and a warning, words that would echo in my mind for hours after he left. "But Elena, I need you to understand something before you decide anything about us or about your future. I'm not a good man. I've done terrible things, and will undoubtedly do more terrible things before my life ends in whatever violent conclusion seems inevitable for men like me. And if you choose to stay here, if you choose to explore whatever this is growing between us, there's no going back to the simple life you had before. No returning to anonymity and safety, and the comfortable delusion that the world is anything other than a dangerous place where the strong protect what's theirs and the weak get crushed beneath the wheels of power and ambition." The door closed behind him before I could respond, and I stood in his office for a long time afterward, processing everything that had just happened and everything it might mean for my future. For our future. For the person I was becoming in this strange new life where I slept in silk sheets and ate food prepared by personal chefs and fell asleep every night to the sound of a dangerous man's voice telling me stories about his complicated past and his uncertain future. I made my way back to the library eventually, seeking distraction in books that couldn't judge me for the feelings I was developing for my rescuer, couldn't warn me that I was making another terrible choice by allowing myself to care about a man who killed people for a living, couldn't tell me that I was confusing safety with love or gratitude with desire or trauma, bonding with genuine connection. And as I curled up in a leather chair that probably cost more than my car and opened a volume of poetry I'd found on the shelves, I realized with a mixture of terror and exhilaration that I'd already made my decision, that I wasn't leaving this house or this life or this man who'd saved me and then offered me something I'd never had before, the choice to be cherished instead of destroyed, to be protected instead of targeted, to be seen as precious instead of disposable in a world where women like me were so often treated as collateral damage in other people's wars.